1219 AD, the walled city of Outran in modern-day Kazakhstan. Governor Inalchuk stood atop the fortress walls, watching as a caravan of 450 merchants approached from the east. These weren't ordinary traders. They carried silk, jade, and silver from the distant Mongol Empire, bearing letters of safe passage signed by Genghis Khan himself. Inalchuk's decision in the next hours would trigger a sequence of events that would reshape the entire world. He ordered the merchants executed and their goods seized, convinced that some were Mongol spies. When word reached Genghis Khan, the response was measured and deliberate. He sent ambassadors demanding justice and the extradition of Inalchuk. Shah Muhammad of the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, commanding armies that numbered over 400,000 men, made a fatal error. He executed the Mongol ambassadors, shaving their beards and sending back only the lone survivor to deliver the message of defiance. Genghis Khan's reply would echo across continents. He assembled his generals and spoke words that would become legend. The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears. What followed was not merely conquest. It was the systematic destruction of an empire that had thought itself invincible, carried out by an army that fought in ways the world had never seen. The Mongol horse archers were about to demonstrate that mobility, coordination, and tactical brilliance could overcome numerical superiority, fortified cities, and technological advantages. This is the story of how the fastest army in history outran, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed every force that stood against them. The Mongol military system was unlike anything that had come before. At its core was the horse archer, a warrior who had spent his entire life in the saddle. Mongol children, both boys and girls, learned to ride before they could walk properly. By age 5, they were practicing archery from horseback. By 10, they were participating in hunts that functioned as military training exercises. By 15, they were ready for war. Each Mongol warrior maintained a string of horses, typically 4 to 6 animals, rotating them constantly to prevent exhaustion. These weren't the large war horses of European knights. Mongol horses were small, stocky creatures, standing barely 13 hands high, appearing almost pony-like to foreign observers. But what they lacked in size they compensated for with endurance, hardiness, and an ability to survive on minimal forage. A Mongol horse could travel 60 miles in a day and maintain that pace for weeks. They could find food where European horses would starve, grazing on grass that other breeds wouldn't touch, even pouring through snow to reach vegetation underneath. The Mongol composite bow was a technological marvel, requiring years to construct properly. Made from horn, sinew, wood, and birch bark glued together in layers and wrapped in bark to protect against moisture. These bows measured just 4 feet long when strung, but could shoot arrows over 300 yards with devastating accuracy. More importantly, they could be used effectively from horseback at full gallop. European longbows were more powerful, but they required the archer to stand stationary. Crossbows packed tremendous punch, but they were slow to reload. The Mongol bow represented the perfect balance of power, speed, and mobility. A skilled horse archer could loose arrows in rapid succession while controlling his mount with his knees, creating a mobile weapons platform that could strike and vanish before the enemy could respond. The Mongol military organization was revolutionary in its efficiency. The army was organized decimally, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, called tumens. Each unit had a commander responsible for his men's equipment, training, and readiness. This system allowed for unprecedented coordination across vast distances. Communication was maintained through a sophisticated system of flags, horsetail standards, and mounted couriers who rode between units at speeds that astonished their enemies. The Mongols could coordinate movements of armies separated by hundreds of miles, executing complex strategic plans that required multiple forces to converge on precise schedules. Unlike European feudal armies where knights fought as individuals seeking personal glory, or Chinese forces where generals commanded from the rear, Mongol warriors fought as cohesive units, executing practiced maneuvers with mechanical precision. Every man knew his role, every unit understood its place in the larger strategy. Discipline was absolute. The penalty for cowardice or disobedience was death, not just for the individual but potentially for his entire unit of 10. This created powerful peer pressure to maintain standards. But discipline was balanced with initiative. Mongol commanders were expected to adapt to circumstances, to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders. The combination of rigid discipline and tactical flexibility made the Mongol army nearly impossible to predict or counter. Intelligence gathering was another Mongol strength that enemies consistently underestimated. Before launching a campaign, Mongol scouts would spend months or even years gathering information about their target. They learned about political divisions, military capabilities, economic resources, geography, and climate. Merchants travelling the Silk Road often served as spies, reporting back on everything they observed. This intelligence allowed the Mongols to plan campaigns with extraordinary precision, knowing exactly where to strike, when to strike, and how to exploit their enemies' weaknesses. When Genghis Khan decided to punish the Khwarezmian Empire, he wasn't launching a simple punitive expedition. He was orchestrating the destruction of a civilization. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Aral Sea, encompassing modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Its cities were among the wealthiest in the world. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Herat were centres of learning, trade, and culture. Shah Muhammad commanded an army estimated at 400,000 men, 10 times the force Genghis Khan would bring into Khwarezmia. The Shah's strategy seemed sound. He dispersed his armies among his major cities, turning each into a fortified strongpoint that would require lengthy sieges to reduce. This would buy time, wear down the Mongol invaders far from their supply lines, and allow the Shah to mass forces for a counteroffensive. It was exactly the wrong strategy against the Mongols. In 1219, Genghis Khan crossed the Sir Darya River with approximately 100,000 to 150,000 men. His 4 sons commanded separate tumans, each a complete army capable of independent operation. The campaign that followed demonstrated every aspect of Mongol superiority, speed, coordination, deception, and absolute ruthlessness. The Mongol advance was unlike any military operation the Islamic world had witnessed. Rather than besieging Outran immediately, Genghis Khan divided his forces in a way that seemed suicidal by conventional military wisdom. His sons Yoshi and Chagatai were assigned to besiege Outran with a relatively small force. His son Ogedi was sent north to capture several smaller cities, but the main striking force, led by Genghis Khan and his younger son Tolui, bypassed the heavily defended border fortifications entirely and drove deep into Khwarezmian territory along an unexpected route through the Kizilkum Desert, a region considered impassable for a large army. The Mongols covered 600 miles in less than 2 weeks, moving faster than news of their approach could travel. They appeared before Bukhara in February 12th and 20th, having approached the city from the west, from the heart of the Khwarezmian Empire rather than from the frontier. The garrison of Bukhara, expecting attacks to come from the east if they came at all, was completely unprepared. The city's military commander attempting to break out with his 20,000 garrison troops was intercepted and destroyed by Mongol cavalry. The citizens of Bukhara, left defenceless, opened their gates. Genghis Khan rode into the central mosque, dismounted, and allegedly climbed into the pulpit. According to chroniclers, he addressed the assembled nobles and clergy with words that have echoed through history. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The conquest of Bukhara demonstrated the Mongol approach to urban warfare. The citadel continued to resist, so the Mongols used the city's own population as human shields, forcing them to fill the moat and approach the walls. When the citadel fell, the garrison was executed. Craftsmen and skilled workers were identified and spared, designated for deportation to Mongolia. Young men were conscripted as auxiliary troops for future sieges. The remaining population was driven from the city, which was then systematically looted before being burned. This pattern would repeat across dozens of cities. From Bukhara, the main Mongol force moved on Samarkand, arriving in March 1220. Samarkand was one of the great cities of the Islamic world, with a population exceeding 500,000 and defended by walls 50 feet high and 30 feet thick at the base. The garrison numbered 110,000 men. Genghis Khan arrived with approximately 100,000 Mongols and perhaps 50,000 auxiliaries, conscripted troops from already conquered territories. The siege lasted only 5 days. How did the Mongols reduce such a fortress so quickly? The answer reveals another dimension of their military genius: psychological warfare combined with ruthless execution. On the first day, the Mongols surrounded the city completely, demonstrating to the defenders that no relief would arrive. Mongol engineers, many of them captured Chinese and Persian specialists, positioned siege engines around the walls. Catapults began hurling incendiary projectiles and stones. But the real attack was psychological. The Mongols drove thousands of prisoners from Bukhara toward the walls, using them to absorb the defenders' arrows and fill the defensive ditches with their bodies. The defenders watched in horror as their fellow Muslims were slaughtered. On the third day, a portion of the garrison attempted to break out, hoping to escape encirclement. Mongol cavalry had been positioned precisely for this contingency. The breakout force was surrounded and annihilated in the open field, where Mongol horse archers excelled. The survivors were driven back to the walls, where the remaining defenders watched their comrades die. By the fifth day, with Turkish garrison troops deserting, the city elders negotiated surrender. The pattern repeated: garrison executed, craftsmen spared, population expelled, city looted and burned. Shah Muhammad, watching his empire collapse, made the catastrophic decision to flee rather than concentrate his dispersed forces for a decisive battle. The Shah had convinced himself that the Mongol army was invincible, a psychological victory the Mongols had achieved through their reputation for ruthlessness. By destroying cities so quickly and so completely, the Mongols created a terror that preceded them. Genghis Khan dispatched his two best generals, Subutai and Jibi, with 20,000 horsemen to pursue the Shah. What followed was one of the most extraordinary military operations in history. The chase covered over 3,000 miles, through some of the most difficult terrain in Asia. Subutai and Jebe pursued the Shah from Samarkand through Afghanistan into northern Persia, then west toward the Caspian Sea. The Mongol force moved with such speed that they covered distances contemporary armies would have considered impossible. They travelled 100 miles in 3 days through mountainous terrain, forded rivers, crossed deserts, and maintained operational cohesion throughout. They lived off the land, captured food supplies, and requisitioned remounts from conquered territories. Shah Muhammad fled from city to city, never staying long enough to organize resistance. The Mongol pursuit was relentless, appearing wherever the Shah sought refuge days after he arrived. The psychological impact was devastating. The ruler of a vast empire was reduced to a fugitive, unable to command his own armies, demonstrating to every subject that their mighty Shah could not protect them. The Shah finally died of exhaustion and pleurisy on a small island in the Caspian Sea in December 1220, broken and defeated without the Mongols ever catching him. His son Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu attempted to rally resistance, and for a brief moment succeeded where his father had failed. In November 1221, Jalal ad-Din assembled a force of 60,000 men and faced Genghis Khan at the Battle of Parwan in what is now Afghanistan. In a shocking reversal, Jalal ad-Din defeated a Mongol army commanded by Shigi Kutuku, one of Genghis Khan's adopted sons. It was one of the few battlefield defeats the Mongols suffered during the entire Western campaign. Genghis Khan's response demonstrated both his tactical flexibility and his determination. He immediately gathered multiple Tumans and pursued Jalal ad-Din personally. The decisive encounter came at the Indus River in 1221. Jalal ad-Din's army, reinforced to perhaps 50,000 men, faced 60,000 Mongols in a battle that would demonstrate the difference between conventional cavalry and Mongol horse archers. The battle began with Jalal ad-Din's forces advancing aggressively, hoping to use their numerical advantage in close combat where the Mongol bows would be less effective. The Mongols employed their classic tactic, the feigned retreat. Mongol units appeared to break and flee, drawing the Khwarezmian cavalry forward in pursuit. As Jalal ad-Din's forces became strung out and disordered chasing the retreating Mongols, the trap closed. Mongol cavalry wheeled and attacked the flanks with devastating archery. Units that had been held in reserve now struck the rear. The Khwarezmian army found itself surrounded, compressed, and subjected to continuous arrow fire from all directions. The carnage was absolute. Persian chroniclers recorded that the Mongols shot so many arrows that they darkened the sky. Jalal ad-Din's army was destroyed as a fighting force. The young sultan, demonstrating extraordinary personal courage, reportedly spurred his horse off a cliff into the Indus River and swam to safety in full armour. Genghis Khan, watching from the opposite bank, allegedly remarked to his sons that a father should wish for such a son. While Genghis Khan was crushing the Khwarezmian Empire, Subutai and Jebi's pursuit force was conducting what would become known as the Great Raid, one of the most extraordinary cavalry operations in military history. Having failed to capture Shah Muhammad before his death, the two generals requested permission to continue westward, scouting potential invasion routes and gathering intelligence. Genghis Khan approved, and 20,000 Mongol horsemen proceeded to ride completely around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus Mountains, and into the Russian steppes. They covered approximately 4,000 miles in 3 years, fighting and winning battles against armies that had never heard of the Mongols. In 1221 they defeated a Georgian army under King George the Flasher. Georgian knights, considered among the finest heavy cavalry in the Christian world, charged the Mongols in the traditional European fashion, expecting their armour and lances to break the lighter-armed steppe warriors. The Mongols used their standard response to heavy cavalry. They retreated before the charge, using their superior speed to stay just out of reach while subjecting the pursuing knights to continuous arrow fire. Georgian horses, burdened with armoured riders, tired quickly. As the charge lost momentum, Mongol cavalry wheeled and counterattacked the now disordered knights. The Georgians were destroyed. King George was wounded and died from his injuries months later. The Mongols continued north through the Caucasus, defeating the Alans and then moving into the territory of the Kipchak Turks. In 1223, the Mongol reconnaissance force encountered a coalition of Russian princes and Kipchak Turks at the Khalkha River. The Russian army, numbering perhaps 80,000 men, vastly outnumbered the 20,000 Mongols. The Russians were supremely confident, never having faced steppe nomads who fought with such discipline and coordination. The Battle of the Khalkha River would shatter that confidence. The Russian princes, unable to agree on a unified command, advanced with poor coordination. Different contingents moved at different speeds, separating the army into disconnected columns. The Mongols, as always, had scouted the terrain thoroughly and knew exactly where each Russian force was located. Subutai executed a masterpiece of mobile warfare. Mongol units engaged the leading Russian contingents with light skirmishing, then retreated, drawing the Russians forward. As Russian princes competed with each other for the glory of striking the first blow, they advanced even more recklessly, leaving their flanks exposed and their formations stretched. The Mongols had been retreating for 9 days, luring the Russians deeper into the steppes, farther from their supplies, and stringing out their columns across dozens of miles. At the Khalkha River, the trap closed. Mongol cavalry struck from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinating their attacks with precision that left the Russians stunned. Russian heavy cavalry, formidable in close combat, couldn't catch the Mongol horse archers who stayed at range, shooting and retreating, shooting and retreating. Russian infantry, caught in the open without fortifications, was systematically destroyed by arrow fire. The coalition army disintegrated. 6 Russian princes were killed, including Mstislav the Bold of Galich and Mstislav of Kiev. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers died. The survivors fled in complete disorder. The Mongols pursued ruthlessly, cutting down fleeing soldiers for days. The treatment of the captured Russian princes demonstrated the Mongol approach to psychological warfare. Rather than execute them by sword or arrow, Subutai had the princes bound and placed under a wooden platform. The Mongol commanders then held a victory feast on top of the platform, slowly crushing the princes to death beneath the weight. This horrific execution was calculated to spread terror throughout Russia. The message was clear: resist the Mongols, and your death will be memorable. The Khalkha River victory was particularly remarkable because it was achieved by a reconnaissance force operating 3,000 miles from the nearest Mongol support. Subutai and Yebe had maintained discipline, coordination and combat effectiveness while moving through completely unknown territory, living off the land and fighting multiple enemies. After the battle, the Mongol force turned east, riding back to Mongolia to report their findings. They had circumnavigated the Caspian Sea, defeated multiple armies, gathered extensive intelligence on European military capabilities and geography, and demonstrated that Mongol cavalry could operate effectively anywhere in the known world. The Great Raid was a preview of what would come. When the Mongols returned to Europe 13 years later, they would come not as a reconnaissance force but as an army of conquest. And they would use every lesson learned during the Great Raid to devastating effect. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 represented the culmination of decades of military evolution. By this time, the Mongol army had absorbed Chinese siege engineers, Persian administrators, and warriors from dozens of conquered peoples. But the core remained the horse archers, now refined into the most efficient killing force the medieval world had ever seen. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, commanded the invasion force of approximately 150,000 men. His chief general was the brilliant Subutai, now in his 60s but still the most capable commander in the Mongol army. The target was Europe, specifically the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary, rich lands that could support the expanding Mongol Empire. The European kingdoms, having heard rumours of the Mongol destruction of Russia, prepared for war. But they fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. Europeans thought of the Mongols as barbarian raiders, similar to the Vikings or Magyars of previous centuries, fierce but disorganised, capable of raiding but not of sustained military operations against armoured knights and fortified positions. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The Mongol army divided into multiple columns, a standard operating procedure that Europeans interpreted as evidence of poor coordination. In reality, the separated forces were executing a carefully orchestrated plan that required precise timing and navigation across hundreds of miles. One Mongol column under Kaidu invaded Poland, while the main force under Batu and Subutai invaded Hungary. The Polish campaign demonstrated the Mongol ability to coordinate operations across vast distances. Kaidu's force defeated a Polish army at the Battle of Chmielnik in March 1241, then systematically destroyed several smaller forces while advancing toward the city of Legnica. Duke Henry II of Silesia assembled a coalition army of Poles, Germans, and Teutonic knights, approximately 25,000 men, representing some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. On April 9, 1241, these forces met the Mongols at the Battle of Legnica. The Europeans were confident. Their knights were heavily armoured, riding large war horses, and skilled in the mounted charge that had dominated European warfare for centuries. The Mongol cavalry appeared lighter, almost primitive in comparison. What the Europeans didn't understand was that the Mongols had been perfecting tactics to defeat heavy cavalry for decades. The battle began with a Mongol provocation. A small unit of horse archers approached the European lines, shot several volleys, then retreated. Duke Henry, seeing an opportunity, ordered a cavalry charge. The knights thundered forward in a magnificent display of martial prowess, lances levelled, armour gleaming, the pride of European military tradition. The Mongols retreated. The knights pursued, gaining confidence as the Mongols fled before them. The chase continued for several miles, the knights convinced they were routing a cowardly enemy. Then the Mongols stopped running. As the European cavalry arrived, blown from their charge and with formations disordered from the pursuit, Mongol cavalry that had been hidden in the landscape attacked from both flanks. At the same time, the retreating force wheeled about and opened fire. The Europeans found themselves in a killing zone, attacked from three sides by mounted archers who stayed just out of reach of lances and swords. The knights, burdened with 60 pounds of armour on horses carrying similar weight, couldn't catch the Mongol cavalry. Their horses tired quickly under the sustained pursuit. Meanwhile, Mongol arrows found gaps in armour, joints, visors, anywhere the protection was weak. Horses, less protected than riders, were primary targets. When a warhorse fell, its armoured rider became helpless, unable to rise quickly or fight effectively on foot. The disciplined Mongol formations wheeled and turned in practiced manoeuvres, maintaining their deadly fire while avoiding contact with the still dangerous European knights. When knights tried to reform for another charge, the Mongols retreated again, maintaining distance while continuing to shoot. The process repeated. Charge, retreat, pursuit, ambush, archery. The European cavalry was systematically destroyed without the Mongols ever accepting a direct melee engagement, where armour and lances might have given the knights an advantage. Chroniclers recorded that the Mongols used smoke bombs to create confusion, one of many technologies they had adopted from Chinese warfare. Duke Henry attempted to retreat with his personal guard, but Mongol cavalry pursued and cut them down. Henry was killed, and according to legend his head was cut off and paraded on a lance. The Mongol practice of mutilating enemy dead and displaying the results served both to identify kills for accurate record-keeping and to terrify future enemies. The Battle of Legnica was a complete Mongol victory. achieved against supposedly superior European military forces. But Legnica was merely a diversion. The main Mongol objective was Hungary. King Bela IV of Hungary commanded a substantial military force, perhaps 60,000 men including heavily armoured knights, Croatian allies, and Templar knights. He established a fortified camp on the Sarjo River at Mohi, confident that his numerical superiority and defensive position would allow him to defeat the Mongol invaders. On April 10, 1241, one day after Legnica, Subutai orchestrated one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. The Battle of Mohi would demonstrate every element of Mongol superiority: reconnaissance, deception, coordination, mobility, and firepower. The Hungarian camp was protected by the river, with a single stone bridge providing access. Bela positioned forces to defend the bridge, believing it would be impossible for the Mongols to cross elsewhere. This was exactly what Subutai expected. While a Mongol force made a noisy demonstration at the bridge, drawing Hungarian attention and reinforcements, Subutai personally led the main force on a night march, moving several miles upstream where his scouts had identified a fordable section. The Mongols crossed the river before dawn, undetected, using their superior reconnaissance and night movement capabilities. At first light, both Mongol forces attacked simultaneously. The diversionary force at the bridge suddenly intensified their assault, deploying Chinese-designed trebuchets that hurled projectiles into the Hungarian positions. At the same time, Subutai's force struck the Hungarian camp from the flank and rear. The Hungarians, caught between two forces and surprised by the flank attack they thought impossible, tried to form defensive positions. But the Mongols weren't interested in a static battle. Mongol cavalry swept around the Hungarian formations, encircling them with remarkable speed. Arrow fire poured in from all directions. Hungarian knights attempted several charges, but each time the Mongols retreated before contact, maintaining their fire, exhausting the Hungarian horses. The encirclement tightened methodically. The Hungarians, compressed into an increasingly small area, suffered catastrophic casualties from the continuous archery. Then Subutai executed the final phase of his plan. The Mongols deliberately opened a gap in their encirclement, leaving an apparent escape route toward the west. The panicking Hungarians, seeing a chance to flee, abandoned their formations and streamed through the gap. This was exactly what Subutai wanted. An organised army in defensive positions was difficult to destroy completely. A fleeing mob was helpless. As the Hungarian army disintegrated into a mass of fugitives, Mongol cavalry pursued, cutting down the running soldiers for miles. The slaughter continued for 2 days. Contemporary estimates put Hungarian losses at 50,000 men, though modern historians consider this exaggerated. Even conservative estimates suggest 10,000 to 15,000 Hungarians died, including a substantial portion of the kingdom's military elite. King Bela survived by fleeing ahead of the Mongol pursuit, but his kingdom was defenceless. The Mongol victories at Legnica and Mohi, achieved within 24 hours on fronts separated by hundreds of miles, demonstrated their operational coordination. These weren't separate raids, they were synchronized operations executing a unified strategic plan. After Mohi, the Mongols systematically devastated Hungary. Cities were besieged and captured, populations massacred, and the countryside laid waste. The Mongols were preparing to continue into Western Europe, where no military force existed that could have stopped them. Then, in December 1241, news arrived from Mongolia. The great Khan Ogedei, son of Genghis Khan, had died. Mongol law required all princes and generals to return to Karakorum for the election of a new Khan. Batu Khan, despite being on the verge of conquering Vienna, and possibly all of Western Europe, turned his armies around and began the long journey home. Europe had been saved not by military resistance but by political necessity. The Mongol withdrawal has led to centuries of historical speculation. What if Ogedei hadn't died? Could the Mongols have conquered all of Europe? Military historians examining the evidence generally conclude that yes, European resistance would have been futile. The Mongol army had already defeated the best forces Europe could field. The military technology, tactics, and organizational capabilities of 13th century European kingdoms were inadequate to counter mobile, disciplined horse archers executing sophisticated operational plans. European castles would have fallen to Mongol siege techniques, already proven against far more formidable Chinese and Persian fortifications. European knights, for all their individual prowess, fought as individuals rather than coordinated units, making them vulnerable to the Mongol combined arms approach. Perhaps most critically, European kingdoms lacked the intelligence networks, communication systems, and strategic coordination that allowed Mongol forces to operate effectively across continental distances. The Mongol military system succeeded because it represented the culmination of centuries of steppe warfare evolution, enhanced by technologies and tactics absorbed from sedentary civilizations. The horse archer was the ultimate expression of mobility and firepower in the pre-gunpowder age. A Mongol warrior was simultaneously a scout, a skirmisher, a heavy cavalryman, and a siege auxiliary. He could ride 60 miles in a day, fight a battle, and be ready to do it again the next day. His composite bow could penetrate chainmail at 100 yards. His mobility allowed him to choose when and where to fight, negating the advantages of armour and fortifications. The Mongol organisational system allowed forces to coordinate across distances that would have left any contemporary army fragmented and ineffective. The decimal structure, the sophisticated communication networks, the emphasis on reconnaissance and intelligence, all of these created an army that functioned more like a modern mechanised force than a medieval cavalry host. Discipline and training were maintained through constant practice. Mongol armies conducted massive hunts called batyus that served as military exercises, with thousands of warriors coordinating to encircle game across hundreds of square miles. These hunts developed the skills needed for battlefield encirclements and taught warriors to maintain formation and execute complex maneuvers. The meritocratic command structure ensured that the most capable men led, regardless of birth. Mongol generals rose through demonstrated competence, not aristocratic lineage. Subutai, the greatest general of the Mongol age, was a commoner's son who rose to command armies because of his tactical genius. The Mongol approach to warfare was fundamentally about efficiency. They didn't fight for glory or honour, they fought to win as quickly and completely as possible. If terror could make an enemy surrender without battle, the Mongols used terror. If a city submitted voluntarily, it was spared. If it resisted, it was destroyed so completely that other cities would learn the lesson. This ruthless pragmatism shocked civilizations that still clung to concepts of chivalry and honourable combat. But it was devastatingly effective. The Mongol reputation for massacring resistant populations was deliberately cultivated and carefully maintained. After destroying a few cities completely, the Mongols found that most others surrendered without resistance, saving Mongol lives and allowing faster conquest. The integration of foreign technologies and foreign troops demonstrated Mongol adaptability. Chinese siege engineers, Persian administrators, Russian auxiliaries, all were incorporated into the Mongol system. The Mongols didn't consider themselves superior to all other peoples, they simply took what worked and discarded what didn't. By the time of the European invasions, the Mongol army was a truly multi-ethnic force, held together by common military, culture, and ruthless discipline. Yet the core remained the Mongol horse archer, the warrior who had grown up on the steppes, learned to ride before he could walk, and practiced archery from horseback until it became instinctive. The long-term impact of Mongol conquests extended far beyond military history. The Pax Mongolica, the period of Mongol rule across Eurasia, facilitated trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The Silk Road became safer than ever before, allowing goods, ideas, and technologies to flow between East and West. But the immediate impact was devastation. The populations of Persia and Central Asia, China, and Russia suffered catastrophic losses. Cities that had stood for centuries were erased. The irrigation systems of Khwarezm, built over millennia, were destroyed and have never been fully restored. The demographic impact was so severe that some regions didn't recover their pre-Mongol population levels for centuries. Yet the Mongol conquests also demonstrated certain harsh truths about military effectiveness. Organisation, discipline, and mobility proved more important than individual valour or technological advantages. An army that could move faster, coordinate better, and adapt more quickly would defeat larger, better-equipped forces that lacked these qualities. The horse archer, perfected by the Mongols, represented the ideal combination of mobility and firepower for its era. Not until the development of effective firearms would sedentary civilizations develop a counter to mounted archery. Even then, it would take centuries for infantry firearms to match the rate of fire and effective range that a skilled horse archer could achieve. The Mongol legacy in military thought extends to modern times. Their emphasis on mobility, surprise, and deep operations influenced military theorists from Clausewitz to the developers of modern mechanized warfare. The German blitzkrieg tactics of World War II, emphasizing breakthrough, encirclement, and exploitation, echo Mongol operational art. Modern military concepts of maneuver warfare, where speed and positioning defeat the enemy's cohesion rather than simply destroying his forces, have their roots in steppe cavalry tactics. The Mongol approach to intelligence and reconnaissance, gathering detailed information before operations and using that intelligence to plan precisely targeted strikes, is now standard military practice. For the civilizations that faced them, the Mongols represented an existential nightmare. An enemy that moved faster than news could travel, that appeared in unexpected places, that couldn't be brought to decisive battle unless they chose to fight, and that executed complex strategic plans with mechanical precision. European chroniclers, struggling to explain the Mongol victories, attributed them to demonic powers or divine punishment. They couldn't accept that these steppe nomads, considered primitive and barbaric, had developed military capabilities that exceeded anything Christian Europe could produce. The reality was that the Mongols had perfected a way of warfare suited to their environment and their culture, then scaled it up through organizational genius to create the most effective military force of their age. The horse archer wasn't just a warrior, he was a complete military system. His mobility was his armor, his bow was his artillery, his endurance was his logistics. Multiply that individual by thousands, organize them into coordinated units, lead them with meritocratic commanders, and support them with absorbed technologies from conquered civilizations, and you have the Mongol army. An instrument of war so effective that it conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The question asked by generations of historians is why the Mongols succeeded where other steppe nomads had failed. Huns, Turks, and dozens of other nomadic confederations had raided sedentary civilizations for centuries, but none had conquered with such completeness, or held their conquests for so long. The answer lies in organization and adaptation. Previous nomadic groups had relied on tribal structures that limited their scale and cohesion. Genghis Khan broke the tribal system, reorganizing the Mongol nation along military lines that transcended traditional kinship bonds. This allowed the Mongols to maintain unity and discipline even as their empire grew. Previous nomads had raided for loot, then returned to the steppes. The Mongols conquered and held territory, using the resources of sedentary civilizations to fund further expansion. They became a hybrid power, combining steppe mobility with Chinese administrative systems and Persian cultural sophistication. The Mongol military system eventually declined, as all military systems do, when conditions changed and enemies adapted. The rise of gunpowder weapons, particularly in China and the Islamic world, gradually negated the advantages of horse archery. Cannon and arquebuses could kill armoured warriors and their horses at ranges that bows couldn't match. The effectiveness of Mongol mobility decreased as enemies improved their fortifications and developed defensive systems specifically designed to counter fast-moving cavalry. The Mongol Empire itself fragmented after the death of Kublai Khan, breaking into separate khanates that eventually fell to resurgent Chinese, Russian, and Islamic powers. But the military revolution the Mongols represented had lasting effects. They demonstrated that mobility and coordination could overcome static defense and numerical superiority. They showed that an army operating as an integrated system was more effective than a collection of individual warriors, however brave or well-equipped. They proved that intelligence, planning, and logistics were as important as battlefield prowess. When we examine the Mongol conquest through the lens of military history, we see not barbarian hordes overwhelming civilized peoples through savage ferocity, but a sophisticated military organization executing well-planned operations with technological and tactical superiority. The Mongol horse archer didn't succeed because he was more brutal than his enemies. Medieval warfare was universally brutal. He succeeded because he was faster, better coordinated, more disciplined, and more effectively employed than any contemporary warrior. The technological aspects of Mongol superiority deserve deeper examination. The composite bow, central to their effectiveness, was itself the product of centuries of refinement. The construction process took over a year. Artisans would begin with a wooden core, typically birch or maple, shaped to provide the basic structure. On the belly of the bow, facing the archer when drawn, they would attach layers of horn which resist compression. On the back of the bow, they would attach layers of sinew which resist tension. These materials were glued together using a mixture derived from fish swim bladders, creating a bond that remained flexible but incredibly strong. The entire assembly was then wrapped in birch bark and leather to protect against moisture. The result was a bow that stored enormous energy in a compact package. When drawn and released, the composite bow's combination of materials created a whip-like effect, accelerating the arrow to velocities that exceeded what a simple wooden bow could achieve. A Mongol arrow could reach speeds of 200 feet per second, delivering kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate chainmail at typical combat ranges. Equally important was the arrow itself. Mongol arrows were precisely constructed with different types optimized for different purposes. Armor-piercing arrows featured narrow, hardened steel heads designed to punch through mail and plate. Broadhead hunting arrows maximized tissue damage against unarmored targets. Whistling arrows, with perforated heads that created a distinctive sound, were used for signaling. Each warrior carried 2 quivers, one attached to his belt and one to his saddle, holding between 60 and 100 arrows total. In sustained combat, a skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute, though brief bursts of faster shooting were possible at close range. The Mongol saddle was another critical technology, purpose-built for mounted archery. Unlike European saddles designed to keep a knight firmly seated during a lance charge, the Mongol saddle allowed the rider to shift position easily, stand in the stirrups, or even turn completely around to shoot backward while retreating. The high cantle and pommel provided support without restricting movement. Stirrups, which had been adopted from earlier steppe peoples, gave the archer a stable platform. A Mongol warrior could brace himself in the stirrups, freeing both hands to operate his bow while his knees controlled the horse. This seemingly simple arrangement required years of practice to master, but once mastered it transformed the warrior into a mobile weapons platform far more flexible than anything sedentary armies could field. The horses themselves represented centuries of selective breeding. Mongol horses were descendants of Przewalski's horse, the wild steppe horse native to Central Asia. Generations of breeding had emphasized endurance, hardiness, and an ability to survive on minimal forage. A Mongol horse could maintain condition grazing on steppe grass that would starve European horses bred for agricultural environments. They could paw through snow to reach grass, could go for days with minimal water, and could recover from exhaustion more quickly than larger breeds. Their small size, often dismissed as a weakness by Europeans, was actually an advantage. A smaller horse required less food, could navigate rough terrain more easily, and was a smaller target. What they lacked in the ability to carry a heavily armoured knight, they compensated for with endurance that allowed them to cover 60 to 100 miles in a day and maintain that pace for weeks. The Mongol remount system was perhaps their greatest logistical advantage. Each warrior maintained a string of horses, rotating them to prevent exhaustion. On campaign, a Mongol army travelled with enormous herds of spare mounts, sometimes outnumbering the warriors themselves. This meant that Mongol forces never faced the problem that crippled other medieval armies: exhausted horses unable to continue operations. When one mount tired, the warrior simply switched to a fresh one. This system allowed Mongol armies to maintain operational tempo that seemed impossible to their enemies. Contemporary sources frequently expressed disbelief at the distances Mongol forces covered. European armies, with each knight typically possessing one expensive warhorse that required careful management, moved at a pace dictated by infantry and supply wagons. Mongol armies, entirely mounted and living off the land, moved 3 to 4 times faster. Intelligence gathering before campaigns was conducted with the thoroughness of a modern military staff operation. Mongol merchants travelling the Silk Road served as intelligence agents, observing and reporting on everything from political situations to road conditions. When Subutai planned the invasion of Hungary, he had detailed maps of the terrain, knowledge of Hungarian military capabilities and political divisions, and information about climate and seasonal conditions. This intelligence allowed the Mongols to plan operations with precision that seemed almost supernatural to their enemies. The Mongol communication system during operations was equally sophisticated. Mounted couriers riding in relays could carry messages across vast distances at speeds that wouldn't be exceeded until the telegraph. The YAM system, a network of relay stations spaced about 25 miles apart, allowed messages to travel up to 200 miles in a single day. During the European invasion, Batu Khan in Hungary could receive messages from and send orders to forces operating in Poland, maintaining coordination across fronts separated by hundreds of miles. Flag signals and smoke allowed tactical communication on the battlefield. Each unit carried distinctively marked standards, allowing commanders to identify friendly forces and coordinate movements visually. The sophistication of Mongol signalling systems often went unrecognized by European observers who assumed that nomadic armies fought as disorganized mobs. The Mongol approach to siege warfare demonstrated their ability to absorb and improve upon technologies from conquered peoples. Early Mongol armies struggled with fortified positions, lacking the expertise to reduce walled cities efficiently. But after conquering northern China, the Mongols incorporated Chinese siege engineers and their technologies. Chinese catapults, trebuchets, gunpowder weapons, and siege towers were all adopted and integrated into Mongol operations. By the time of the Khwarezmian campaign, Mongol armies could reduce fortifications as quickly as any contemporary force. The treatment of conquered populations followed calculated patterns designed to maximize compliance and minimize resistance. Cities that surrendered immediately were generally spared, required to pay tribute and provide supplies but otherwise left intact. Cities that resisted were destroyed, their populations massacred or enslaved, and the destruction was publicized to encourage other cities to surrender. This created a powerful incentive structure: resist and die, submit and live. The effectiveness of this approach is demonstrated by the number of cities that opened their gates at the first sight of Mongol armies. The massacres, while horrific, were strategically rational from the Mongol perspective. They reduced the need to leave garrison forces in conquered territories, eliminated potential rebels, and created terror that facilitated future conquests. Modern estimates suggest that the Mongol conquests killed between 30 and 40 million people, approximately 10% of the world's population at that time. But these deaths weren't random slaughter. They were the result of calculated policies designed to break resistance and establish control. The deportation of skilled craftsmen and their families to Mongolia and other Mongol-controlled territories demonstrated the more constructive aspect of Mongol policy. Engineers, artisans, scholars, and administrators were valuable resources, and the Mongols recognized their value. Cities like Samarkand, when rebuilt under Mongol rule, became centers of culture and learning, staffed by craftsmen and scholars brought from across the empire. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, became the foundation for one of history's most efficient communication networks. At its height, the system stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, with relay stations providing fresh horses and supplies for authorized couriers. Merchants using the system could travel from one end of the empire to the other with relative safety, knowing that Mongol authority protected them. Marco Polo's journey to China was made possible by this infrastructure. The religious tolerance practiced by the Mongols, unusual for medieval empires, was another pragmatic policy. The Mongols themselves practiced a form of shamanism, but recognized that their empire encompassed dozens of different faiths. Rather than attempting to impose religious uniformity, they generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religions, even granting tax exemptions to religious institutions. This tolerance reduced one potential source of resistance and allowed the Mongols to govern diverse populations without the constant religious conflicts that plagued other empires. Genghis Khan himself reportedly said that all religions were like fingers on a single hand, different but part of the same whole. The Mongol law code, the Yasa, established uniform standards across the empire. While harsh by modern standards, mandating death for theft, adultery and other crimes, it provided predictability. Merchants knew what was expected, criminals knew the penalties, and the consistent enforcement reduced corruption. The Yasa also established meritocratic principles, decreeing that positions should go to the competent regardless of birth, and mandating that the Khan himself could be elected from among qualified candidates. These legal principles, combined with the infrastructure of roads and relay stations, created conditions for unprecedented trade across Eurasia. The 13th and 14th centuries saw exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the age of European maritime exploration. Gunpowder, printing, paper money, and countless other innovations spread along routes protected by Mongol power. The eventual decline of Mongol military dominance came gradually. the fragmentation of the empire after Kublai Khan's death in 1294 ended the unified command structure that had made coordinated continental operations possible. The successor states, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, increasingly fought each other rather than expanding the empire. The adoption of sedentary lifestyles by Mongol rulers weakened the warrior culture that had made them formidable. Grandsons and great-grandsons of steppe warriors grew up in palaces, more interested in court politics than military campaigns. The military skills that required childhood development couldn't be maintained by aristocrats who lived in luxury. Technological changes also undermined Mongol advantages. The development of effective firearms, particularly in China and the Islamic world, gave infantry weapons that could defeat cavalry at range. Early firearms were crude and unreliable, but they required less training than archery and could be used effectively by peasant soldiers with minimal preparation. As firearms improved through the 14th and 15th centuries, the advantage shifted decisively toward infantry-based armies. The construction of more sophisticated fortifications, designed specifically to counter mobile cavalry, made raids less profitable and invasions more difficult. European and Islamic engineers learned from their defeats, building walls and defensive systems that forced attackers to conduct lengthy sieges rather than relying on rapid assaults. The rise of powerful centralized states in Russia, China, and the Islamic world provided the organizational capacity to mobilize resources on scales that matched or exceeded Mongol capabilities. When Ivan III of Russia finally threw off Mongol domination in 1480, he commanded an army that was larger, better equipped, and supported by superior logistics than the declining Golden Horde could match. But the military legacy of the Mongols extended far beyond their empire's collapse. The emphasis on mobility, the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, the integration of different military capabilities into combined arms forces all became permanent features of military thought. Russian and Central Asian peoples who had lived under Mongol rule absorbed many of their military practices. The Ottoman Empire, rising in the same period as the Mongol decline, employed horse archers using tactics that clearly derived from steppe traditions. The Mughal Empire in India, founded by Mongol descendants, combined cavalry mobility with gunpowder weapons to create a hybrid military system. European military theorists studying the Mongol conquests recognized principles that challenged prevailing assumptions about warfare. The importance of mobility over static defense, the value of reconnaissance and intelligence, the effectiveness of coordinated operations over individual heroics, these lessons influenced European military development, even if Europeans never successfully replicated horse archer tactics. The Napoleonic emphasis on rapid movement and living off the land echoed Mongol operational principles. The German general staff's focus on detailed planning, coordination of separated forces, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses showed influence from historical studies of Mongol campaigns. Modern military analysis of Mongol operations reveals sophisticated applications of principles that wouldn't be formally articulated until centuries later. The Mongol use of operational art, coordinating multiple forces across strategic distances to achieve objectives that individual forces couldn't accomplish, anticipated modern concepts of deep operations, their emphasis on destroying enemy cohesion rather than simply inflicting casualties prefigured maneuver warfare doctrine, the integration of different capabilities, horse archers for mobility and firepower, heavy cavalry for shock action, siege engineers for fortifications, foreign auxiliaries for specialized tasks, created combined arms teams that maximized effectiveness. The Mongol reconnaissance screen, deployed ahead of the main force to gather information and shape the battlefield, served the same function as modern reconnaissance units. The feigned retreat, used repeatedly against European knights, demonstrated understanding of psychological factors in combat, exploiting enemy aggression and overconfidence to create tactical advantages. The deliberate opening of escape routes during encirclements to turn organized resistance into panicked flight showed appreciation for the difference between defeating and destroying an enemy force. When we examine specific Mongol campaigns through the lens of military science, we find operations that would earn highest marks in modern staff colleges. The invasion of Khwarezmia demonstrated strategic planning, dividing forces to attack multiple objectives simultaneously, using speed and surprise to prevent enemy concentration, and exploiting interior lines to defeat a numerically superior enemy in detail. The pursuit of Shah Muhammad showed operational persistence, maintaining pressure on a fleeing enemy across thousands of miles to prevent reorganization. The Great Raid exemplified economy of force, using a relatively small detachment to achieve strategic reconnaissance while tying down enemy forces. The European invasion of 1241 demonstrated synchronized operations, coordinating attacks on multiple fronts separated by hundreds of miles to prevent mutual support. The Battle of Mohi showed tactical excellence, using deception, night movement, and double envelopment to achieve decisive victory against a larger force in prepared positions. Each of these operations required capabilities that contemporary European, Islamic, or Chinese armies struggled to match. The ability to move large forces rapidly across difficult terrain while maintaining coordination and supply, the ability to gather and process intelligence to understand enemy dispositions and intentions, the ability to execute complex plans requiring precise timing and navigation without modern communications or positioning systems, the discipline to maintain formation and execute practiced maneuvers under the stress of combat, the flexibility to adapt plans when circumstances changed. These capabilities weren't accidental or the result of barbarian ferocity. They were the product of systematic development, rigorous training, and organizational sophistication. Mongol warriors began military training in childhood and continued throughout their lives. The Great Hunts served as exercises that developed and maintained the skills needed for battlefield operations. The meritocratic command system ensured that the most capable leaders rose to positions of authority. The harsh discipline, including the practice of collective punishment, where entire units could be executed for the failure of individuals, ensured that standards were maintained. The Mongol willingness to learn from enemies and adopt superior technologies or tactics demonstrated intellectual flexibility often absent in more tradition-bound military cultures. When Chinese siege engineers proved superior to anything the Mongols possessed, they were captured and integrated into Mongol armies. When they encountered gunpowder weapons, they studied them and eventually adopted them. When they needed to govern sedentary populations, they recruited administrators from conquered peoples. This adaptability was possible because the Mongols never confused cultural practices with military effectiveness. They maintained their core identity as steppe warriors, while pragmatically adopting whatever worked from other cultures. This combination of cultural confidence and practical flexibility made them formidable, not just in conquest, but in consolidating and governing their empire. The psychological warfare practiced by the Mongols deserves recognition as a force multiplier as important as their military technology. The systematic cultivation of a terrifying reputation meant that enemies often defeated themselves through fear before contact. The publicizing of massacres, the display of severed heads, the horrific execution methods used on captured leaders all served to spread terror that preceded Mongol armies. Cities surrendered without resistance, armies broke and fled at the first sight of Mongol cavalry, and rulers abandoned their thrones rather than face capture. This psychological dominance was deliberately created and carefully maintained. The Mongols understood that terror was as effective as weapons in breaking enemy resistance. But this terror was coupled with the promise of mercy for those who submitted. Cities that opened their gates were spared. Soldiers who surrendered were sometimes recruited into auxiliary forces. Craftsmen and administrators who cooperated were rewarded. This combination of extreme violence against resistors and relative clemency for those who submitted created powerful incentives for surrender. The efficiency of Mongol military operations is demonstrated by comparing their conquest of vast territories with the efforts of other contemporary powers. The Crusades, waged by European powers for 2 centuries, failed to permanently conquer even a small portion of the Holy Land despite enormous investments of resources and lives. The Song dynasty of China, despite technological superiority and vast resources, took decades to reduce the territories of neighbouring states. The Mongols conquered the largest contiguous empire in history in roughly 50 years, from Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongol tribes in 1206 to the completion of the conquest of China under Kublai Khan in 1279. This speed of conquest reflected not just military prowess but organisational capacity. The Mongols could mobilise resources, move armies, conduct sieges, and govern conquered territories with efficiency that exceeded anything contemporary civilizations achieved. The environmental and geographical factors that shaped Mongol warfare are often underappreciated. The Eurasian steppe, stretching from Hungary to Manchuria, provided an environment where cavalry mobility was maximized and infantry-based armies were at severe disadvantage. The grassland supported the enormous horse herds that made Mongol operations possible. The relatively flat terrain allowed rapid movement and long sight distances for reconnaissance. The scattered populations meant that Mongol forces could live off the land through requisition and hunting without requiring elaborate supply lines. This environmental adaptation made the Mongols supremely effective across the steppe and in adjacent regions with similar terrain. But it also created limitations. Dense forests restricted cavalry mobility, making regions like northern Russia and Southeast Asia more difficult to conquer. High mountains, while not impassable, slowed operations and limited the number of usable routes. Tropical climates were problematic for horses bred for temperate and cold environments. The Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 failed largely because maritime operations required capabilities the Mongols hadn't developed. The attempted invasion of Java in 1293 failed for similar reasons, with tropical disease and jungle terrain negating Mongol advantages. These failures demonstrate that Mongol military superiority was conditional, effective in certain environments and against certain types of enemies, less so in others. Yet even accounting for these limitations, the scope of Mongol conquest remains extraordinary. From Korea to Poland, from Siberia to Vietnam, Mongol armies campaigned across an area covering roughly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. The battles and campaigns described in this account represent a fraction of Mongol military operations. Dozens of campaigns, hundreds of battles, thousands of skirmishes occurred across the 13th and 14th centuries. Each demonstrated aspects of Mongol military superiority. The conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China required decades of campaigning and showed Mongol ability to adapt to siege warfare against sophisticated fortifications. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate and the sack of Baghdad in 1258 demonstrated that even the most powerful Islamic states couldn't resist Mongol might. The invasion of Burma in the 1270s and 1280s showed that Mongol forces could operate effectively in tropical environments when necessary. The wars against the Mamluks in Syria and Egypt, where Mongol forces met their match in battles like Ain Jalut in 1260, showed that the Mongols weren't invincible, but required careful strategy and capable opponents to defeat. The question of what would have happened if Ogedei Khan hadn't died in 1241, forcing the withdrawal from Europe, has fascinated historians for centuries. Military analysis suggests that European resistance would likely have been futile. No European army had demonstrated ability to defeat Mongol forces. The military technology, tactics, and organizational systems of 13th century Europe were simply inadequate to counter highly mobile, disciplined horse archers executing sophisticated operational plans. The fragmented political structure of Europe, with dozens of competing kingdoms and principalities, would have prevented the unified resistance necessary to match Mongol resources. The Mongols had already demonstrated ability to defeat coalition forces at battles like the Kalka River and Legnica. The industrial and demographic resources of Europe, while substantial, weren't organized for the kind of total mobilization that resisting the Mongols would have required. The castles and fortified cities that dominated European military planning would have fallen to Mongol siege techniques as fortifications in China and Persia had fallen. The likely outcome would have been Mongol conquest of at least Central and Eastern Europe, possibly extending to the Atlantic. Whether the Mongols could have held such conquest long-term is debatable, but the initial conquest seems militarily inevitable, given the capabilities demonstrated in 1241. The historical counterfactual is ultimately unknowable, but it highlights the degree to which Mongol military superiority was real and substantial, not the result of luck or facing weak opponents. The Mongols defeated the best armies of their age, in multiple theatres, across diverse terrain, using consistent methods that demonstrated systematic superiority. The legacy of the Mongol horse archers extends beyond military history into the broader development of Eurasian civilization. The empire they created facilitated exchange that accelerated technological and cultural development. The terror they inspired entered the cultural memory of dozens of peoples, from Russian folklore about the Tatar yoke to Persian poetry, about the Mongol devastation to Chinese historical memory of the Yuan dynasty. The military lessons they taught influenced warfare for centuries. The importance of mobility, the value of intelligence and coordination, the effectiveness of combined arms operations, all became permanent features of military thought. Modern cavalry tactics, until the mechanization of warfare in the 20th century showed clear descent from steppe traditions. The ultimate irony of Mongol conquests is that they succeeded through capabilities that their enemies possessed in theory, but failed to organize effectively. Europeans had cavalry, but not organized into disciplined units executing practice maneuvers. Islamic armies had horse archers, but not coordinated with the precision of Mongol formations. Chinese armies had siege equipment and gunpowder weapons, but not integrated into mobile operations. The Mongols didn't possess secret weapons or unique technologies. They possessed superior organization, training, and leadership. They fought as teams rather than individuals. They planned carefully and executed precisely. They adapted to circumstances and learned from experience. They maintained discipline under stress and exploited enemy weaknesses ruthlessly. In the end, the Mongol horse archers outran the world's strongest armies because they understood warfare at a level their contemporaries didn't match. They recognized that speed, coordination, and firepower were more important than armor and fortifications. They understood that destroying enemy cohesion was more effective than inflicting casualties. They knew that psychological dominance could win battles before they were fought, and they possessed the organizational capacity to apply these insights consistently across continental distances and diverse opponents. The sound of Mongol horse hooves thundering across the Eurasian steppe represented more than military conquest. It represented the triumph of organization over chaos, discipline over individual prowess, mobility over static defense, and systematic superiority over numerical advantage. When Mongol warriors drew their composite bows and sent arrows arcing toward terrified enemies, they weren't just shooting projectiles. They were demonstrating that the fastest army, properly organized and led, could conquer the world.